Strange cases, eerie legends. Welcome to Shadowy Stories. I'm your host, here every night to tell you a tale.
Good to see you again, friends. Tonight's story is called The Antique Ivory Necklace. Now, this is right up my alley, because those of you who know me might know that your pal Kevin here has dabbled a bit in antique jewelry, ivory pieces, that kind of thing. I know a thing or two about this stuff. So, telling this story, I get pretty into it. When did all this happen? Well, the whole affair spans a long time, but to tell it right, we got to start back in 1988. So, it's 88 in a big city on the east coast of the U.S., let's say Boston. There's this guy, a miner supervisor in an old factory, Mr. Lee. We'll just call him Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee heads down to New Orleans to visit a distant relative. Now, after arriving in New Orleans, Mr. Lee's got one thing on his mind, because he's a serious collector of antiques. Plus, back in those days, most folks didn't have a lot of spare cash, so the prices for antiques were still pretty low. What kind of guy was Mr. Lee? He was the type who'd sell his old house in Boston just to get the money to buy these antiques. Now, you might think Mr. Lee was a bit nuts back then, but looking at it now, Mr. Lee back then had a killer eye. He'd be a millionaire many times over today. And yeah, Mr. Lee did end up making a fortune from his collection, but that kind of guts Mr. Lee had back then, most ordinary folks just don't have it. Heading to New Orleans to visit family, Mr. Lee knew the place was steeped in history, a real melting pot. Definitely the kind of place where you could find some weird and wonderful old items. So, Mr. Lee brought pretty much all his life savings, about $14,000 in total, and off he went to New Orleans to visit relatives. On the surface, it was a family visit, but secretly, once Mr. Lee got to New Orleans, his mind was elsewhere. He spent every day prowling through antique markets, flea markets, just browsing. After a few days, Mr. Lee's relatives started to notice something was up with their visitor from Boston. What was he doing every day? He was supposed to be staying with them for a while, but every morning he was out the door early and back late at night, sometimes even showing up completely drunk. "Old Lee," they'd ask, "you got other friends here in New Orleans or something?" "No, no other friends." "And what are you doing all day long?" "Oh, just wandering around. Your antique market's here. I just pop in and browse. You know I've always been into the stuff." "Ha! Most of the stuff in those antique markets is fake, just tourist traps." Mr. Lee heard this, but didn't say much. He was thinking to himself, fake or real, that depends on who's looking. You amateurs see fakes, but I can spot the real deal. Mr. Lee didn't even want to talk to his relatives about it anymore. But a little while later, his relative told him he had a friend he could introduce Mr. Lee to. And he specifically told Mr. Lee, "This guy, he's an old fellow who works as a boiler operator at their workplace. But if I introduce you, you absolutely cannot look down on him. Because this guy, he doesn't care about appearances, always looks dirty and disheveled. But let me tell you, his family, they're gold-touching officers by trade. A family of tomb raiders, going way back. And I'm not kidding you, even his father got caught and did hard time for tomb raiding back in the 60s. When his relative said this, Mr. Lee's heart started pounding. Wow, is there really such a person? I came to New Orleans looking for exactly this kind of guy, someone with that earthy smell, insider term for the aura of freshly excavated artifacts. Mr. Lee knew the lingo. Immediately, Mr. Lee's expression changed. He eagerly asked his relative, "Where is this man? When can we meet? I'd love to meet this so-called master of the hidden world." The relative, seeing this Mr. Lee from Boston was so interested in their local weird stuff, said, all right, don't worry about it. I'll set up a meeting for you in a couple of days." But Mr. Lee couldn't wait. From the moment they talked about it, the very next day he started pestering his relative non-stop. Finally, on the evening of the second day, the relative told Mr. Lee, "Tonight, let's not eat at home. I've arranged to meet him. We'll go to a little joint nearby that sells gumbo, eat and chat there." Mr. Lee immediately asked, Who is it? Is it him? The old boiler operator from your workplace?" "That's right, it's him." "Great! Mr. Lee was so excited he practically slammed the table. "This one's on me. I'm dying to meet this guy." And so the three old-timers met up in a very run-down little eatery that served gumbo. Mr. Lee was no fool. Living in a big city like Boston, he'd seen all sorts of strange characters. People from all walks of life. Drifters, performers, peddlers, you name it. He knew a bit about the jargon, the slang, and the unwritten rules of these underground circles. As soon as he met the old man, he started to test the waters, use insider language to gauge the other person's knowledge. When Mr. Lee dropped a few spring points, code words, slang from the trade, the old boiler operator's eyes lit up immediately. He saw Mr. Lee was an insider. He shot back with his own spring points, and just like that, the two of them were conversing. Mr. Lee's relative, sitting beside them, was getting more and more confused. "What in the world are you two talking about? Is that even English? Are you speaking a foreign language or something?" But the two of them just chuckled and didn't explain. And insiders know the rules when they meet other insiders. That night, the meal at the gumbo joint didn't last very long, but the two of them had already secretly made an arrangement.
When they made their plans, they spoke in riddles and slang that an outsider wouldn't understand. But in reality, the two of them had already agreed. This Sunday, when everyone was off work, at the main entrance of a famous antique market in New Orleans, 9:30 in the morning, they'd meet again to talk details. With an outsider present today, it wasn't convenient to discuss sensitive matters. So, just like that, the dinner meeting ended. What happened afterwards, we won't go into. Let's fast forward to Sunday morning. Mr. Lee was up and out early. He got to the antique market entrance, and the old boiler operator arrived punctually at 9:30. After they met, the two of them officially began their negotiations. During their conversation, Mr. Lee learned that this man's family had been in this line of work for generations. Of course, it wasn't a respectable family tradition, not a good thing at all, but it was true. Their ancestors had been doing this for a long, long time. The man was originally from a remote small town in Louisiana, not New Orleans proper. But later, because he had no family left back home, he moved to New Orleans. In his entire family, only he and an old uncle were left. All the other men in their line of work had gone in, a jargon for being arrested or dying unexpectedly. Do you get what that means? Basically, this family was full of daredevils playing a deadly game. Mr. Lee heard this and thought, "This guy is the real deal." He immediately asked cautiously, "So, old master, do you have any goods on hand right now? Things aren't so tight anymore. I can eat." The man pondered for a moment. Perhaps he really was short on cash. After a whole day of back and forth and feeling each other out, he finally, very mysteriously, told Mr. Lee that he did indeed have one item. But this item, the man was clever. He didn't just try to sell it. He dangled it in front of Mr. Lee, saying, "This piece, it's a bit hot. But don't worry, it's not hot in the way you're thinking, legally speaking. It doesn't have a bloody history, and it's not some national treasure. But this item, it's definitely a bit unusual." And what was so unusual about it? According to the man's story, this thing was something his great-grandfather's generation had brought up from below, a jargon for excavated from a tomb. When they brought it up, it was inside an ancient wooden box. His great-grandfather had personally gone down into the tomb. Inside the tomb, he opened the wooden box and found an ancient inscription carved inside, which seemed to say that this item must be handled and displayed only in direct sunlight, otherwise it could lead to great misfortune. Of course, the ancient inscription wasn't written so plainly, but that was the gist of it. His great-grandfather brought the item out. Later, some of his great-grandfather's family members wanted to experiment, saying, "Let's see what happens if we don't look at it in sunlight." But his great-grandfather forbade it. And more importantly, this item, it was a necklace. The material and craftsmanship of this necklace indicated it wasn't from the tomb of some great noble or famous historical figure, and it didn't seem to have much historical value or associated stories, meaning the tomb it came from was probably just that of some wealthy ancient landowner or minor official. But let me tell you, you can't just look at the origin, because this necklace, it was carved from ivory, and it was an antique ivory bead necklace of exquisite craftsmanship. Each bead was polished perfectly smooth and had a warm, lustrous sheen. Anyone who deals in these things knows the value of antique ivory. Of course, if something has a particularly illustrious origin and well-documented provenance, then that's what you look at. But if the origin is ordinary, then the core value lies in the quality of the ivory itself and the craftsmanship. In other words, regardless of how old the antique ivory is, the first thing to consider is its historical and cultural value. If that's average, then you absolutely must examine its material and craftsmanship. If the material is top grade and the craftsmanship is exquisite, then the price of that antique ivory will be several times, maybe even 10 times, the price of a comparable new ivory piece from that era. If the material is so-so and the craftsmanship is crude, then even if it's an antique ivory piece that's hundreds or thousands of years old, it's only worth a little bit of money. Mr. Lee from Boston, when he heard this guy's spiel, was a bit dazed. Is there really such a thing? What is this? Why does it have to be seen in sunlight? But the man couldn't explain the mystery clearly to Mr. Lee. That day, he took Mr. Lee to his house to see the goods. Well, when Mr. Lee saw that ivory necklace, he was floored. That top-quality, ivory white, lustrous texture, he'd only ever read about in books or seen it in museums. No one could really say what constituted truly top-tier quality, but the ivory beads in front of him, Mr. Lee stared at them, practically drooling. The ivory had a faint, creamy yellow hue, like congealed fat. The texture of the entire string of beads seemed to contain a layer of warm oiliness, and the surface of these ivory beads bore the fine cracks and patina characteristic of antique ivory, naturally formed over many years, known in the trade as smile lines and skin. Mr. Lee took a look and thought, "Holy cow! Regardless of whether this thing came from a famous family or has some earth-shattering history, this is absolutely a top-tier, incredibly rare treasure." At that moment, Mr. Lee made up his mind. Even if I have to call up all my old colleagues and friends, swallow my pride and borrow money, I have to get this ivory necklace. The haggling process that followed, we'll skip over that. It was too long. Let's move on quickly. After a tough round of negotiations and bargaining, Mr. Lee managed to acquire this ivory necklace for $6,000 back in the late 1980s. Do you know how much $6,000 was in 1988? In some places, $6,000 could almost buy you a small house. Just think about it. Mr. Lee actually dared to spend that kind of money to buy this ivory necklace. After buying it, he immediately took it back to Boston and kept it carefully hidden at home, never mentioning it to anyone. Mr. Lee always thought to himself, "This ivory necklace, when my son is in his 20s or 30s and needs money, never mind trading it for an apartment, even if someone offered me a detached house for it, I might not even be willing to trade it." Why do I say this story spans a long time? Because after Mr. Lee bought this ivory necklace in '88, not even his wife knew about it, let alone anyone else in the family. Mr. Lee kept this treasure locked in a safe in his study, just like that, quietly hidden away. Until, in the blink of an eye, times changed, society developed rapidly, and it was the year 2002. Only then did Mr. Lee finally decide to bring out this ivory necklace and let it see the light of day again.
Mr. Lee bringing out this ivory necklace? This time, it was out of necessity. What happened? His son was getting married and needed money urgently. By 2002, real estate prices in Boston had started to skyrocket. Plus, his son's fiancée, her family was very well off. Although her family didn't make things difficult for his son, Mr. Lee, being a proud father, wanted to give his son a good showing to maintain face. He and his wife hadn't saved much money over their lifetime. All they had was a bunch of these antiques. Over the years, among all of Mr. Lee's collectibles, the only thing truly valuable and presentable was that ivory necklace he'd acquired in New Orleans. So, Mr. Lee decided, for his son's sake, to reluctantly part with his beloved treasure. After Mr. Lee made his decision, he took the ivory necklace to a small, not-so-reputable pawn shop. He wanted an old appraiser there to take a look and see what kind of price they could offer. This old pawnbroker, he was an industry veteran with a sharp eye. He took Mr. Lee's ivory necklace, examined it carefully, and his eyes nearly popped out of his head. Mr. Lee could clearly see that this old fox was deliberately trying to lowball him on his treasure. That's the way it works in the pawn business. Jargon for slaughtering the pig. You can't easily show your hand. But as the old man was examining it, his hands were unconsciously trembling. Even so, this highly experienced antique appraiser back in those days opened his mouth and offered Mr. Lee $20,000. As soon as Mr. Lee heard that, he knew. He'd paid $6,000 for it back then, and it was definitely a huge steal. This was absolutely a genuine piece and incredibly valuable. Mr. Lee didn't say a word, just took his treasure, turned around, and walked out. Now Mr. Lee had a baseline. He started putting out feelers in the antique collecting community. Then he took beautiful, multi-angle photos of the ivory necklace and showed them around. Look what I've got here. Are you interested? At that time, antique dealers and collectors from Asia, Europe, and locally in the U.S. all contacted Mr. Lee. They made some offers, but the prices were never quite right. Plus, Mr. Lee was a bit possessive of his treasure. He wasn't too keen on selling to foreigners in general. And so this treasure stayed in his hands, going back and forth for about 4 months. After about 4 months, a businessman from Florida showed up. This businessman was a complete amateur when it came to antiques, knew next to nothing about ivory. But even the most clueless amateur could tell that Mr. Lee's ivory necklace was something special. Its luster and texture were undeniable. When this Florida businessman saw Mr. Lee's treasure, he didn't even blink, didn't try to haggle at all. He just said to Mr. Lee, "I'll give you $880,000. $88,000 was considered a lucky number back then. To be honest, although the necklace was exquisite, it didn't have a distinguished provenance or history. For even the best ivory, selling for $880,000 in those days was pretty darn good. But Mr. Lee, having seen the world in a big city like Boston, well, he had high aspirations and a big appetite. He countered, "I want $1,880,000. But what Mr. Lee never expected was, right there at the dinner table that day, after hearing his price, the Florida businessman slammed his hand on the table and agreed on the spot. Mr. Lee was stunned. He agreed just like that? And what's more, that Florida businessman had $50,000 in cash in his briefcase, and he just slapped it on the table right then and there as a down payment. Now Mr. Lee was really in a bind. He'd named his price, the guy had paid a deposit, and so, somewhat inexplicably, Mr. Lee had agreed to sell the ivory necklace. That night back home, Mr. Lee knew he'd agreed to finalize the deal in 3 days. He would indeed receive $1,880,000, which would not only solve his son's wedding money problems, but also allow him to live a very comfortable life. But this ivory necklace, Mr. Lee just felt that selling it like this was a bit of a waste. He muttered to himself, "Damn, this thing. Its quality is so good, the craftsmanship is so exquisite, it should be worth at least $18,888,000.
How did I only sell it for $1.88 million? I really shot myself in the foot. Why did I say $1.88 million? The more he thought about it, the more unwilling he became, the more he felt he'd been ripped off. What could he do? These past 2 days, he'd been living in agony, waiting at home for the deal to go through, constantly racking his brains for an excuse, some way to back out, not to sell it to him. He agonized like this until the afternoon of the last day. The very next day was the official transaction. Mr. Lee sat alone in his study, chain smoking, feeling completely drained. He kept feeling like he'd betrayed his years of collecting, that he'd sold his treasure sensations too cheaply. But then again, he'd already agreed, taken the deposit. It seemed the deal had to go through. Then Mr. Lee didn't know what came over him, but a strange thought suddenly popped into his head. That's right. This thing, it hasn't just been sitting in my hands for all these years for nothing. Didn't that old guy who sold it to me say it had to be opened and handled in sunlight? But now, it's about to be sold to someone else. It won't be mine anymore. Should I, just for this last chance, open it under the moonlight and see what it's really like? What could happen? You know how people are. Sometimes, no matter what the situation, they just get possessed by a foolish idea and do something self-destructive. That night, Mr. Lee was acting as if he was bewitched. Around 9:30 p.m., he stood alone on his balcony, watching the bright moon hanging high in the sky. Bathed in the cool moonlight, he opened the small ancient wooden box that held the ivory necklace. But the moment he opened the box, there was a small, soft pop. A cloud of grayish, slightly earthy-smelling smoke billowed out of the box, shot up towards the ceiling of his apartment, and then quickly dissipated. When Mr. Lee recovered from his shock and looked down into the wooden box after the smoke had faded, oh my God! The exquisite ivory antique necklace that had just been nestled inside was gone! All right, folks, that's the story for tonight.